Just heard our correspondent say that Salah Abdeslam is going to stay tight-lipped, he says, for the remainder of the trial. What are you expecting to learn from this trial?
Well, certainly we expected many things, but unfortunately the defendant remains silent. And that all depends on the strategy that he will take later on. We've seen before in criminal prosecutions of terrorist-related offenders, some of them appear really emotionless, some of them are assertive. We've seen before, for instance, one of the Boston Marathon bombers, Jahar Tsarnaev, first was really emotionless, and later on, only later he started sharing some details. So it all depends what strategy he will take, whether he will share any evidence or any details of the attacks and logistical efforts that he participated in. And probably it might not happen in Belgium, it might happen when he will be on trial in France. So we'll just have to wait.
Yeah, because we're talking about three trials, aren't we? Where there's the case of what was described by our correspondent, that shootout at their hideout in the suburb of Forest. And then a few days later, the Brussels attacks. And of course, as you were mentioning, previous to that, the Paris attacks, which presumably were orchestrated from that working-class neighborhood of Brussels, Molenbeek. Julia RUSHCHENKO, what are you expecting to learn about how this cell works? What's the biggest gray area for you?
I think, first of all, we still lack information about masterminds of the attacks, first. Second, whether there were any other individuals involved. So it was a transnational cell. But were there any other countries involved or individuals who resided in other countries? And finally, I think what is important is whether other attacks were being planned. Right in the wake of the Brussels attacks, there were news that apparently, according to intelligence gathering, terrorists were also planning an attack on a nuclear power plant in Belgium. So whether it's true or not, this has to be definitely, we have to hear more details, and hopefully we'll be able to during this trial or the following trials.
Have lessons already been learned in terms of how these cells work?
Certainly. So most of the Islamist attacks in the recent years, specifically in the last year, in the last 2 years, are ISIS-inspired. This, for instance, attack is perpetrated by multiple actors, but they all have foreign links, and they're all ISIS-inspired. But they're also lone wolf terrorists. So there isn't any particular pattern of how a cell or an individual can work. But what we've seen is very often, so the Paris attack and the Brussels attack do not really conform to the same tendency. But we've seen last year a huge number of attacks that are low-tech, the so-called low-tech soft-target attacks with the vans, with the knives. This is, of course, a very different modus operandi that we've seen in France.
In the case of the group that carries out the Paris attacks, and then later on we have the remainers, the remnants of that cell, which carry out the Brussels attack, that kind of cell with that amount of people, is it still plausible, possible, or as you were just describing, smaller attacks have since taken place?
I think smaller attacks have a higher chance of succeeding nowadays, taking into account stricter border control, law enforcement official actions, and general awareness of these attacks being possible, especially now as the caliphate is crumbling, territorial losses in Syria and Iraq, so there'll be likelihood of more attacks in Western Europe.
Julia RUSHCHENKO, just one final question for you. The defendant, is he going to be able to make political hay out of this trial? The fact the statements that he made, that he only answers to Allah, will this be a recruitment tool in a way? His performance in court.
I think there's a number of strategies that the defendant, especially in this high-profile criminal cases that have to do with the harm inflicted on civilians, multiple deaths, multiple strategies of how they can behave themselves. So one, for instance, is when defendants are really assertive, as we've seen with Anders Breivik, for instance, trial. Another one when individuals show remorse and collaborate. And now we see that Abdeslam is actually taking the third one. He is refusing to collaborate. He is not absolutely not participating in anything, and he is basically sabotaging everything. And by doing that, he's showing us that he does not believe in any criminal justice process in Europe. He doesn't believe that it has any legitimacy. So certainly it shows some message for general Islamist propaganda efforts worldwide.
Julie RUSHCHENKO, who lectures in criminology at the University of West London, many thanks for speaking with us.